Thank you very much for joining us this evening in our ongoing review, looking in some detail at the different post-war landscapes which have been added to the Historic England Register in 2020. This week, as Helen said, we begin our final chapter on private gardens. And there are 4 of these, and I wondered if perhaps the gardens would attract a wider audience, as they would be easier for people to enjoy and recognize as special, and even perhaps familiar places, rather than the other groups we've looked at, the landscapes to commercial developments, new town parks, or to housing estates. So our objective with these talks is to raise awareness about the work, the ideas, and the thinking of the original designers, and also how these sites are now looking, to see what we can learn from this and take forward, to find out more about where the relevant archives are, and what makes these places still so very special. So this week, we're really pleased to have David Ward and Chris Gibson as speakers. Dave Ward is the Garden and Nursery Director at Beth Chatto Gardens and also a trustee of the Beth Chatto Education Trust. He trained at the Norfolk College of Agriculture and Horticulture and also at Merris Wood College, studying nursery practice. And after working in wholesale and retail nurseries, he joined Beth Chatto in 1983 and became her propagation manager. He assisted at 4 Chelsea Gold Medal exhibits and recently contributed extra chapters to reprints of Beth Chatto's drought-resistant planting, her Woodland Garden, and the Green Tapestry revisited also. So, Dave, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all. I really appreciate it. I've got 40 minutes to get through 50, 60 years of history, so I'm going to crack on. I think someone's going to keep an eye on the time for me, so thank you very much. First of all, I really can't begin any talk without just mentioning Beth. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be here listening to me. So Beth started out, she was an Essex girl, born and bred. She was born in Good Easter, not far from Great Dunmow Way, Braintree Way. A twin, Beth on the right there, and Seeley, her twin brother, on the left there, and that's her mother. Her parents were actually very good gardeners. Her father was a local policeman who eventually was posted out to Elmstead Market, which is how Beth arrived to be here. So this is a very quick resume of Beth's early life, but Beth was, she met Andrew Chatto at Elmstead Market. Now, Andrew Chatto, one of the briefs I have is to talk about influences on Beth, and Andrew, her husband, was her major influence, really, her mentor. He was a fruit farmer, local fruit farmer. He went to Y College to learn how to be a farmer. He was exempt from fighting in the war, being a fruit grower. So Beth got to know him throughout the sort of early years of the war, and they married in 1943. There's a lovely picture there, Beth sort of looking at Andrew in admiration there. And he was several years older than Beth, 17, 18 years older, I believe. But he is an interesting character, Andrew. I knew him obviously later life, a recluse, really, very much a recluse. But as a young man, he went over to California. He went over with his parents to his uncle's farm, which is in Laguna Beach in California. And he was always very interested in nature and the outdoors. And he noticed that the wild plants there were sort of plants he was familiar with back in home in England, plants like ceanothus and Californian poppies, etc. So he asked, how did they get here? And of course, they're wild in California. So that sort of fired his imagination, really, to understand where plants grew in the wild. And although he was a fruit farmer by trade, his real life's passion was studying plants in the wild. Not so much visiting plants in the wild, although obviously that previous picture was taken, I believe, in Corsica on holiday, but he was an academic. He translated books, and you're talking in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, from Russian, from German, all floras, so he could understand where plants grew in the wild and the soils, the combinations, the conditions they grew in. And this built up a encyclopedic knowledge for Beth to dip into when she sort of started her garden. So really very, and a lovely man, very knowledgeable, but a recluse. He was a very quiet person. They lived, Beth and Andrew settled with Andrew's parents in Braeswick. They died sort of quite around about the wartime and left the family home to Beth and Andrew. So Braeswick is the other side of Colchester, on a very heavy, sticky soil. The soil here varies quite a lot. In the other side of Colchester, we're east of Colchester. So west of Colchester, it's more sort of towards Suffolk, the Suffolk clay. And they were told really that Beth would never be able to make a garden on that kind of soil. She would have to find somewhere else more suitable to grow all the plants that she really wanted to. So they sort of gravitated back to Andrew's farm, which was 100 acres of land around Elmstead Market. And in 1960, they built the house here and settled on site, just on the sort of side of the 100 acres that Andrew owned. And this is you must never call it a bungalow. Beth would have, this is a house, split level house, built in 1960 on a very sandy bank overlooking the garden. And I'm sure many of you may well be familiar with the garden, but it does look much the same now. The windows have changed slightly. And I'm quite pleased to say the little dormer window at the top, little roof sticking out of the main roof there, slightly to the left, that's Andrew's study, which is now where I have my computer. I don't call it my office, I still call it Andrew's study, and he would look out over the garden there. Inside a split level house, actually featured in Homes and Gardens of its time. So the house is really integral to the garden. The whole garden is sort of around the house, but it's not an old house. It is very much not a 1960s, but quite a clean design inside, very open, living quarters upstairs and the sort of kitchen and living room downstairs. And that's Beth's table where she would write and work in the middle there. The other sort of major mentor of Beth obviously was Sir Cedric Morris, who gardened up at Benton End, up at Hadley in Suffolk. I think this is the only picture I really know I've ever seen of Beth and Cedric together. Now, Cedric, Beth came to know through Andrew, and Cedric was just amazing. I mean, whenever we would ask Beth, where did she get a plant from, she would always say, well, of course, it came from Cedric, to the point that I kind of didn't believe her sometimes. It was a bit of a default answer for Beth, but I soon sort of realized that, yes, most of these plants did come from Cedric, a lot of them. So Cedric was an artist, form firmer, a gardener as well. He bred iris, very famous for his Benton range of iris, but he was very interested in species plants. Although he bred the iris, they weren't the sort of too blousy, they were quite pastel shades of iris he was after. So Beth sort of took that on, and I was just listening to a talk by Sarah Cook the other evening on Sir Cedric, and she was just saying, and put the point of view, that Cedric was a major influence really on 20th century gardening, not through himself, but through Beth and other gardeners as well. But Beth had the sort of the communication skills perhaps to sort of take Cedric's ideas further. So he was a major influence, and a great source of plants to Beth as well. That's a great picture of Andrew on the left, and Cedric on the right, and I believe that was taken in the garden here, probably late 1970s, around about 1980 that was taken. Unfortunately, I never met Cedric myself, although I came here in 1983. Cedric died, I think he died in 82 or early 83, so I never met Cedric, but I've certainly met him since through all his plants. Beth, from her sort of, she sort of settled into married life. They had two daughters. Beth and Andrew had two daughters, and when they were living at Braeswick, they lived adjacent to a nursery run by a lady called Mrs. Desmond Underwood. That's how she liked to be known. Now, I've tried to find out a bit more about Pamela Underwood, Desmond Underwood, but it's been impossible. All you can find out about her is this: she was a formidable woman. I knew the nursery later on when it was called Ramparts Nursery, selling silver and grey plants, carnations, dianthus, that kind of plant. But Pamela Underwood, whose actual real name I've got written down here, she was called Pamela Richenda Cubitt Montgomery Cunningham. So no wonder she wanted to be called Mrs. Desmond Underwood. But she was obviously a sort of an influence on Beth, a mentor, but and she encouraged Beth to develop her flower arranging skills, which Beth seemed to have a knack for. And this very sort of simple arrangement really just personifies Beth's flower arrangement. This is one from the 1950s, and she won many awards at the Colchester Flower Club, which she founded. I think it was the second flower club in the country. She founded along with Mrs. Underwood. And I'd like you just to look at that picture, because Beth's garden, really, I can see Beth's garden in that picture and the way she plants, that sort of very triangular, very simple form. And I'll be showing that picture later on. It's a form of flower arranging that Beth picked up from Japan called Ikebana. Now, I'm no flower arranger at all, but even I can appreciate that is just beautiful to me. And I will be showing that slide later on. I just picked this up on the internet, I must admit, just a screen grab to that was just a little write-up of Beth's first talk. Pamela Underwood sort of pushed her to do a talk up in near Woodbridge, and Beth just felt it was time to sort of break away from her sort of domestic life, looking after two daughters, and she took it on and thoroughly enjoyed it. It tells a little story there. Beth wrote afterwards how Andrew drove her up to Woodbridge, but later on she actually had to learn to drive herself. Now, I went in a car once with Beth when she drove, and I never again let her drive. She was not the best driver, and she wouldn't mind me telling you, and she was quite happy for me to drive, and I was very happy to drive as well. So just a little story there. And that's Beth flower arranging there. A bit more ornate, that one, just inside the house there. Although the fruit farming, Andrew was sort of, the fruit farming is you have one good year, three average years, and a couple of bad years every so often. It wasn't really making money, so Beth was constantly going out, giving talks, flower arranging demonstrations, and people would ask her where could they buy the plants that she was showing. And of course you couldn't in those days, in the 1960s. There weren't the garden centres around, there just weren't the outlets of plant people to buy unusual plants. And certainly the plants that Beth grows, and we still grow today, were very unusual back in those days. So she started up a small nursery, growing plants, and eventually in 1967 she registered the nursery as a business, called it Unusual Plants, and this is just one of the catalogues that she produced every year or two. We'll go to the next one. Please go to the next one. There you go. So the nursery sort of developed alongside the garden, and we'll get to garden a bit later. And this is Beth's first helper, Madge Rowell, running the nursery there. All the plants were very healthily grown, bedded into sand, which was a nightmare because they would root into the sand, and you had to give customers a fork to dig them out of the sand. All grown in whale hide pots. I don't know if anyone remembers whale hide pots. Not made of whales, by the way. They were made of bitumen oil product. So grew very healthy plants, but as soon as you dug them out of the sand, they wilted, unfortunately. So I did change that as soon as I arrived. So eventually Beth was invited to, again, sort of pushed really by Mrs. Underwood, to attend some flower shows. Would she go up to London and exhibit some plants at the RHS halls at Vincent Square? So February 1975 or 6, I'm sorry, I can't remember. She went up in the spring and took along lots of hellebores, lots of plants that were in flower, lots of foliage, of course. You can see a saxifrage in the front there. And it caused quite a stir, really. It hadn't really been seen before. It was at ground level. Most stands were sort of staged on sort of, desk high staging, arranged as her garden, really. Beth just took part of her garden up to London. So that really inspired a lot of interest and controversy as well, because people really thought that some of the plants were just weeds. I mean, it's Hellebores foetidus there, which is a native. But people could see through that, and they could see this was something different. And of course, that eventually led to Chelsea Flower Show, where Beth won 10 gold medals, and really propelled her name and the nursery and her garden to the general public. And it's just one side of Chelsea. That's what I'd like you to look at there, is how similar that is to this flower arrangement I show you. And if I just flick to that flower arrangement, that triangular sort of design that Beth always had in her mind. You can see the triangles there. Hardly, not many flowers. There's the pink persicaria. Everything else is foliage, contrast of foliage, shape and form, which Beth always had at the forefront of her mind when placing plants in the garden. And Chelsea, of course, was a fantastic place to play around with all those features. Sorry, I just love that photograph. Of course, the great and the good came along. Personally, I find the Angelica in flower more interesting there, because they used to be quite difficult to get into flower for Chelsea. So Beth there, and the Queen Mum. That picture always reminds me of the spitting image character of the Queen Mother. I think that might have been at Sandringham Flower Show, actually, maybe not at Chelsea. I'm not quite sure about that picture. Beth, of course, wrote many books. Her first book was published in 1978, called The Dry Garden, and this is a picture of Beth at our local bookshop down in Wivenhoe, signing some books. She went on to write several books, mostly about her experiences in the garden at Elmstead Market. The Dry Garden was her first, the Damp Garden followed, the Woodland Garden, the Gravel Garden eventually. And then, of course, she wrote books in conjunction with Christopher Lloyd, or a book in conjunction with Christopher Lloyd as well. Fantastic communicator. Beth was not only a great gardener and a nurserywoman as well, but she was a great communicator through her books, through her lecture tours, and just through talking to visitors. We still have so many people come to the gardens and say, they remember speaking to Beth in the garden. So wonderful. I mentioned Christopher Lloyd. Of course, Beth, not a mentor as such of Beth's, but a great friend. She first met Christo in around about the early 1970s, 1974, I believe. He was a judge at Chelsea, of course. And it was just a simple letter that Beth objected to Christo's opinion of begonias, which Beth loves. We're very keen on begonias in the garden. They're vital in our gravel garden. Christo and his heavy clay soil down in Sussex at Great Dixter couldn't get on with them, so he was very dismissive of them, and Beth wrote to him, put her point of view across, and he just said, simply sent her a postcard back and said, come to dinner and we'll kind of talk about it. And that was the start of a great friendship. So Beth would spend a week or two down at Dixter quite regularly, especially throughout the sort of 70s and 80s. So in two totally different gardens as well. And of course, it all culminated in various awards. Beth was awarded the VMH and Lawrence Medal, etc., and the OBE in 2002. And she was desperate to get Prince Charles to buy some plants, basically. And eventually they have at Highgrove bought plants from us, but apparently he doesn't like grasses, which Beth was never very impressed with. He loves ferns. All this while, really, the garden was developing alongside the nursery. So we sort of gone through a very potted brief history of Beth there, and we'll sort of move on to the garden a bit really here. This picture was around about 1980, late 70s, 80, and you can see the fruit trees to the top. We were surrounded by fruit farms, some of Andrew's original orchards as well. They've now all long gone, unfortunately. I have to mention, I mean, there's been hundreds of staff who have passed through the gardens. Beth could never have done this without all those staff who have contributed to the gardens, not only today, but in the distant past. This is Harry Lambert, who, I mean, strong as an ox, you can see there, digging out clay like it was just, nothing really. And Harry worked for Andrew over on the farm, and he's kind of came over and worked for Beth in the gardens, doing lots of the formative work. Another man I must mention is Keith Page, who's standing there with Beth. Keith was Beth's technical manager, if you like. He put everything in place for the nursery, the electrics, the irrigation, as well as worked in the garden as well. So Keith and his son works for us now. In fact, he's a fellow director, Gerard Page. And of course many other stuff. So this is really how the garden looked when Beth came here in 1960. Just a wilderness, really. The one thing that really swayed Beth to settle on that particular spot, or this particular spot, was the fact that there was water there. There was constant running water with a little ditch that's just off to the left of that picture. And indeed, the water gardens were really one of the first parts of the garden to be developed once you got away from the house. So this is a very early picture. Sorry, I just heard a message. And that's what it looks like roughly today. I mean, it's the birch tree unfortunately has gone, but lovely flowering cherry, Prunus tahuki. This is about April time. Lots of late daffodils, leucojum, snowflakes in flower there. And I mean, another thing that the garden is really listed for as well is this sort of tapestry of planting and Beth's planting style. And wherever we are in the garden, whatever the conditions, it's just full of flowers and plants, foliage, textures, form. And that's a really good example in the water garden area. Bog primulas, forget-me-nots, Dharmira is the big parasol-shaped plant in the middle. I love adding that picture because nobody takes a picture from the middle of the pond. I was standing in the middle of the pond one day clearing it out, so I do like to include that picture. Water gardens again, just full of flower, not necessarily this time of year, but later on in the year, they come into their own. So lots of really good sort of insect plants there: asters, helenium, echinacea, fantastic for butterflies, and probably the star amongst there is the persicaria, the pink spires behind the cone-shaped echinaceas, wonderful, attracting all kinds of pollinating insects. Just later in the year, autumn. So the garden is very, a garden for all seasons, really. This is probably late October, early November, with the golden larch just showing colour, the butter yellow of a ginkgo a bit further on there. I popped this picture in for Chris to pick up on, a thalia that's growing in the pond there. He might mention that a bit later. And then we sort of move out to the Woodland Garden. The Woodland Garden was really the catalyst for making the Woodland Garden was the storm, the hurricane in 1987. So we had to do a lot of clearing up in the wood, a lot of thinning out, really. That's a picture of Beth shoveling organic matter. Whenever a tree was planted, she liked to see lots of organic matter being added to the soil. And today, that's what it looks like. So from being quite a wild wood, I remember watching foxes play in that wood. It's changed into this, which, I mean, the diversity of flower and foliage is fantastic. Big hostas there. It's a very dry wood as well. Very much a spring wood, full of aconites and snowdrops. Snowdrops there. Oh, sorry, go back a bit. Just finishing flowering now, and then a bit later on, all kinds of spring flowers. Whoops. So that's the Woodland Garden, and then onto the probably most well-known parts of the garden is the drought-resistant gravel garden. So it was on the site of our old car park that we built the gravel garden. But even before the car park was there, it was orchard, and the trees in the background there are now, they're trees on the site of the gravel garden. And this is part of the old nursery that Beth developed close to the house, that's now part of the sales area. So the orchards came right through the gravel garden, but they were all grubbed up eventually to make the car park. You can see Beth's house and her wonderful new greenhouse there, which we still have, although it does need a lot of repair at the moment. So the soil here is extremely dry. We are essentially sand and gravel overlying London clay, and on the site of the gravel garden, this is basically what we're faced with. That's Beth sort of running the sand and the gravel through. So in 1991, autumn 91, we were able to complete the purchase of some land to move our car park over the other side of a Leylandii hedge, and Beth created the dry garden. This is her trying to mark out where the beds are going to be, where the paths are going to be, by using a hose. These are all techniques. I mean, Beth taught us so much, really. Little simple techniques, common sense techniques that we still practice today. So a hose pipe, just with a fork in to secure it, and you can pull a nice curve and adjust it as you wish. Lots of organic matter added to the soil. Again, something that we still do these days, just to give the plants a good start. That's rather hazy picture of Beth telling me what to do there. Just a couple of things to note: the planting, we choose plants from the nursery. Beth never would grow plants specifically for the garden. She wanted plants to come directly from the nursery. So they were plants that people would be taking home with them. So she had confidence in her plants that they would grow, given the right preparation. So that's the gravel garden. So this is sort of spring 1992 there. So the plants, none of this was sort of laid out by plan. It was all done in Beth's head, moving plants around. What she did have was these lists of plants. Any plans were made after the bed was planted, but she would have lists of plants, little ideas, little combinations, and we would sort of put these plants together, and she would dip into this palette of plants to make up her planting. And that's the way she worked, and in fact it's the way we kind of still work, really. We certainly don't make plans. So we were kind of dreads, and these lists were written on just bits of cardboard. Beth was very much of her time, nothing went to waste. She had the same radio for all the time I knew her, an Roberts radio that I loved, but the only thing you'd replace was the battery. And then the gravel garden as it is today, you know, the epitome of right plant, right place, which is a term that Beth didn't coin, but she says she never said that and never invented that, but she certainly took it on a step or two and made it her own. So the dry garden, we never irrigate, we never water. It's on very dry soil, so the plants have to be, going back to Andrew's research, chosen very much to survive these dry conditions. So it's a lovely Stipa barbata and Stipa gigantea, the golden oak grass in the distance. The whole area is, we like plants to seed around. There's no edges to the borders, there's no membrane. It's very important for us to plants to seed around. So this is a lovely tulip called Tulipa sprengeri, which is quite an expensive tulip still to buy, but it's took us years for that tulip to seed around and give that sort of naturalistic effect. And the yucca there is such a useful plant as a structural plant there. Just a little nod to Andrew and California, a plant that was added not at the beginning of the gravel garden, but a bit later. This is the Californian tree poppy, Romnea coulteri. So it's just nice to have that connection back to Andrew and his days in California. I took that picture this morning, actually. So just to go to show you, the eucalyptus, by the way, is only so the gravel garden was planted in 1992, so we're talking 30 years ago. That eucalyptus is probably 80 feet tall now. Not a tree we'd recommend you plant next to your house, but in this space here, it's fantastic. And lovely New Zealand Libertia front, lots of bulbs coming up, some early, though it's still chilly, some early bees out today, Chris, which was nice to see. So the final part of the garden is sort of around the house, the old Mediterranean garden that Beth talked about initially and wrote about in her dry garden book. By the sort of mid 90s, it was becoming a bit tired, and Beth wanted to do something different. So out she came again and sort of marked out some raised beds. It's in fact a miniature gravel garden, and that's Beth planting away there with a and we did water this area. It's close to the house, so Beth did tend to water in the evenings these plants to get them established. That's the effect today. This sort of tapestry of planting and really fine, minute detail. Just simple plants, sedums, sempervivums, dwarf shrubs, dianthus in the next bed across. So lovely sort of tapestry of plants on the ground. And then the Reservoir Garden, even Beth herself admits that the Reservoir Garden was a bit boring. It was very much sort of, she called it her businessman's garden, sort of low maintenance, evergreen shrubs. But we were well aware that we could do better. So we call it the Reservoir Garden because our farmer enlarged his reservoir in the mid-70s, and lots of the clay was, at Beth's request, put up onto this area. And the idea was to mix it in with the sand and gravel to give her a slightly better soil. It never really happened like that. We just have a layer of clay smeared over it. So in 2015, we decided the only way to deal with it was to strip it out and start again with Beth's absolute, she was delighted that we were tackling it at last. So on we go. So we're sand and gravel gardens. We're not quite used to this clay type soil, although it's not a natural clay. It's dug out from the reservoir. That's our head gardener now, also, who came to us 20 years ago. She now manages the garden and the garden team, of which there are about 6 at the moment, a couple of trainees. And she does a fantastic job. She worked alongside Beth, picking up Beth's techniques. And there she is, forking away, getting some roots out. Oh, wrong way, sorry. But clay, when it rains, clay does this. Can't work on it. So it kind of stumped us a bit. We thought it would just be like the gravel garden, prepare it in the autumn, plant it in the spring, and job done. But didn't quite work like that. So we do put lots of organic matter onto the soil. That's the thing that does break up clay soils. It improves sandy, gravelly soils. So that's some council waste, mushroom compost maybe going on there. But we couldn't really plant it. The rain and the wet had delayed us, so we put a green manure on there for the summer, and then came to plant the next spring. So this is spring 2017 now. And really, it's just, if you can remember the slide with myself and Beth in the gravel garden, much the same there. Orsa's, laying the plants out as she, in her head, sort of thinks how they should go. All the plants are dunked in that tray of water there, so they're really nice and moist before we actually plant them. So no plans made, just a whole list of plants to design with. And that's a picture roughly of it today. Again, I've just chosen this one because it has one of the Benton iris. So a nod back to Cedric, and one of his Benton irises, the name of which I forget. I'm sorry about that. So it's a lovely open area. It's given us lots of opportunity to plant lots of new plants, and we've noticed the customer engagement with this area now is so much different than the old area where people just walked around the grass path and chatted away and didn't really look at the garden. So much more interest now, both for the customer and for us. Just moving sort of, the sort of future. A few years ago now, back in 2013, 14, Beth invited Julia, her granddaughter, to come and work for the business, and sort of take over the business basically in her place, should it happen. And Julie is now managing director, and Beth was very keen. We've always been keen to try and, Beth always called it a learning garden, a teaching garden. She was trying to sort of teach her way of gardening, but it was becoming quite difficult for us as a business to do that. So we set up the Beth Chatto Education Trust, which we now run all our courses through. We're an RHS approved centre. We're not an RHS garden by any means. We're just a partner garden, as many gardens are. So we run all our educational courses through the trust. They have a dedicated area towards well away from the garden, so all the children who come along can go pond dipping and make noise and not disturb our sort of garden loving public too much. So it's a fair way away from the garden. Lovely, they do all kinds of things up there. So Forest Schools is another thing. That's Carolyn who runs all the courses and organises all the courses for the Beth Chatto Education Trust. One thing they didn't have was a dedicated building to work out of. So we now have what we call the Willow Room. So called because there's lots of willows, which I tried to include in the picture there. So that's their base now. And one or two projects sort of going on. Now we're sort of playing around with planting plants into sand. This is just an area just behind the gravel garden, a little bit out of view, but it's given us a chance to see how we can get on with some of our drought-resistant plants into pure sand. So there's about a foot of sand spread over the existing soil, just a rather random selection of plants planted in there, and they were planted in June last year, and I think we lost one plant, never watered, of course. So it's been an interesting first few months. And we also have I can't see, but I think behind my little column to the left, there's a bee post which we were donated, which Chris, I'm sure, finds very interesting, and I've tried to learn a few bees from. We have red mason bees. I know one of the first bees to nest in there. Another sort of thing that really happened by default, by accident this year is we have or last year rather, overflow car park, but because of COVID, we weren't really using that car park, and it was constantly being mowed for no great reason. So one of our estate team, Jason, just said, let's not mow it, let's just see what happens if we don't mow it. And of course it was no mow May as well. So it was a very interesting thing to do. A few paths were sort of cut through it, and we call this our Essex grassland, our Essex sort of prairie, and that's my granddaughter there actually practicing her photography skills. So again, a huge, really interesting to see what popped up, and Chris may be mentioning that as well later on. Another thing we've been involved in, our second symposium has just been announced literally this week. In 2018, we decided to, never done this before, just organize a symposium. It was called Ecological Planting in the 21st Century. To our absolute amazement, we had over 500 people attend. It was held at the University of Essex, just 3 or 4 miles away down the road, over 2 days. And a fabulous array of speakers, as there is this time. So that's just been renounced with the title Rewilding the Mind. So do look out for that. I think I'm almost done with 40 minutes, so I can't really leave any talk without again mentioning Beth. I love this slide of Beth. It was one of the final times I really remember her working in the garden, in the gravel garden, and you see so many pictures of Beth sort of posed really, but here she's just totally enjoying what she's doing. She's pruning a atriplex, a tree purslane in the gravel garden, but I just love the look of joy on her face. She's just doing what she's always loved, and that is working in her garden. And I could go on to cram this all in 40 minutes or so. Has been quite difficult, but that's the end of my slideshow, I believe. Thank you.
Dave, that was fantastic. What a lovely photo to end up with as well. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, Chris is going to give you, I'm just a warm-up act. Chris is going to blow your mind, I tell you. No pressure, Chris.
Thanks, Dave.
Well, so if I can just very quickly introduce Chris. Dr. Chris Gibson is a naturalist, a conservationist by profession, and an ecologist by training. And for most of his career, he worked with Natural England, which must be historic England's cousin. He promotes wildlife, especially in Essex, and for the past year has been wildlife advocate to the Beth Chatto Gardens, advising and enthusing about biodiversity riches to be found in a sustainably managed garden. He says showing the world what is possible is an important step to changing hearts and minds. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Dave, as well for that. That's a really good introduction for me as well, actually, as a relative newcomer to the garden. So as Annabelle suggests, yes, I'm the wildlife advocate for Beth Chatto's garden. I have been for the past year. And my role really is to ensure that we are squeaky green in all of our activities. And Beth would have approved, because Beth was ahead of her time. The idea of right plant, right place, that was a mantra of sustainability, before sustainability had even had a word applied to it. So it really was, before sustainability was a thing, Beth was advocating it. Right plant, right place isn't just about the practice of gardening plants. It's also reference to the network of beneficiaries of the right plants in the right place. The insects, the birds, the mammals, the whole spectrum of biodiversity. All gardens support wildlife, but some are better than others. And I believe that because of the steps we've taken towards sustainability, ours is much better than most. So the short talk is just going to look at some of the wildlife surprises in our garden, the steps we're taking to improve it still further. Growing a plant where it wants to be, well, that's the idea of right plant, right place. It means the plant needs fewer inputs of water or fertilizer or peat or anything like that. And that is great for so many things, not least for the climate of the future. But as I've already suggested, sustainability isn't just from a plant's perspective. What about the little things that help the world go round? Gardeners have invested, historically at least, so much in things to kill them. Molluscicides, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides. Put those together, what you get is ecocide. And there is no place for that in the responsible garden of the future. It's really good to hear this week only that RHS now no longer thinks of pests. They've been rebranded as pollinators, predators, somebody else's food, or biodiversity. And of course, that just represents what we've been doing in the garden for some time, since long before my involvement. The strapline that we operate under, the home of ecological and sustainable planting, is very well deserved, in my opinion. We have holes in our mulleins. We wear those holes in our mulleins as a badge of honour, because those holes are being made by the mullein moth. And what a garden beauty that is. Leave them to be, leave them in full plain sight for all the visitors to see, and you are encouraging the idea of gardens as a wildlife habitat, something which is so important now that most of the countryside isn't a wildlife habitat. Now, while Beth may not have set out explicitly to provide a garden for wildlife, she certainly did so by default. She brought in plants that provide in so many different ways. If we look along the top row, these two here, the Nautea macedonica and the eryngiums, they are drought-tolerant plants, very rich in nectar and pollen, food for wildlife. Then we have a lot of plants like down here, plants which have the correct number of naughty bits in the middle. All too many roses, for example, don't have the bunch of stamens in the middle which produce the pollen. They have extra petals. They promise everything and deliver nothing to the wildlife. Likewise, the lace cap hydrangeas rather than the mophead hydrangeas, they've got the plants, the little flowers in the middle with the naughty bits in them. That's what wildlife needs, and our garden is full of them. Another group of plants that provide are those plants that provide out of season. At a time like now, when nature is waking up earlier and earlier every year, climate change is upon us. Don't believe what Donald Trump and the others say. Climate change is a fact. It's upon us, and our bees are coming out. I often see bumblebees on January the 1st. So to plant plants in the garden which occupy or provide nectar during the midwinter period, such as the aconites and the sarcococca, that is the sort of thing which maybe not knowing why she was doing it, but Beth was doing it from a very, very early stage in the evolution of the garden, and we are now seeing those benefits. So there are plants to provide. There are also plants not to provide, and Dave has already alluded to this one, the Thalia, or as it's usually called English-wise, powdery alligator flag. That's the plant there in the pond. It's a very stately plant, big leaves, they look very attractive. It's got rather grotty flowers, but nonetheless, some people like them, and has long been a feature of our ponds. Now, about 3 years ago, I was walking around the garden with my wife and looked at the Thalia flowers and looked what's happening on them, and found they are a veritable mortuary of dead pollinators. Not a good idea when you're in a stage of the existence of the planet where we are losing biodiversity left, right and centre. We need the pollinators. We don't want them to be gobbled up by the plants. Why did they gobble them up? Well, this is a plant from the wetlands of Central America, where they're pollinated by carpenter bees. Carpenter bees are big old chunky things, and they get onto the flowers and they get captured by the snout, by the stigma, elastic stigma of the flower. The bees then shuffle around, get pollen dislodged onto them, but they're powerful enough to get out. They can get out. Our honeybees, our bumblebees, our hoverflies, our wasps, they're simply not powerful enough, and Thalia is a murderer in the garden pond. So I raised this with the garden. This is before my involvement with them. In fact, it probably was one of the reasons I got involved with them. And very admirably, they said, all right, right, that's not good. And it was withdrawn from sale. They've started also to decide that, yes, we maybe don't need to grow it in gardens, in the garden, or at least we don't need to let it flower in the garden. As I've already said, the flower's a bit grotty anyway, so cut out the flowers there so they're not going to do any harm. So that's just an example of the steps we're taking to encourage the biodiversity in our garden. Plants that provide and taking away plants that don't provide. And the results have been magnificent. All you've got to do is to walk around that garden and you will see wildlife at any time of the year. In May, the green hair streak is one of the absolute beautiful jewels that flies around in the garden, and better there in our garden than any other area I know in Northeast Essex. More reliable there. It is found on the sandy grassland areas throughout the rest of the North Essex, but never so abundant as I've seen here in Beth Chatto's garden. Then there's the impressive things like the tanner beetle. Now, that's rather quite a scarce beetle which lives in dead wood. It lives in our garden too. We're looking after it, we're providing the habitats it needs. So right plant, right place, but also right features, right place for the wildlife, such as the tanner beetle. During the last couple of years, when I've been visiting regularly, we've found all sorts of wonderful creatures there. Now, just a small example of those, but these are all creatures which are new to the area. The bug, Clostratomus trivialis, when I found it in the garden, was the first record ever for East Essex, Northeast Essex. Likewise, the little black and grey ladybird, which flashes orange when it flies away. That was the first record for Northeast Essex, the first record for Essex away from Greater London. And then here, the Locust Blowfly, well, what about that? That, as its name suggests, lives on locusts, lives in Africa. It's now a very rare immigrant to this country. We found one in the garden 3 or 4 years ago, and that was the very first time this creature had ever appeared in Essex. So this is just a wonderful snapshot of the rarities we've got. we've got rarities, we've got special creatures, and then we've got creatures doing wonderful things in the garden, common things doing uncommon things that one doesn't normally see. Love and death in the flower beds. That's what this is all about. If you take the time to look in any garden, in Beth Chatto's garden as much as anywhere, take the time to look and you will find exciting things going on. So again, another snapshot of the things I've recorded in that garden during the last couple of years. Here we have at top left, we have Malachite Beetles, two-spotted Malachite Beetles kissing. That's the love bit. They're kissing, they're feeding each other. It's mutual feeding. They're feeding each other the bonding pheromones that keep them together. Isn't that sweet? Not so sweet down here. You have the scorpion fly. Looks rather fierce. It's not. That's a male scorpion fly. He's got no sting in his tail, but what he has got is a very long snout. And I've always heard about scorpion flies using their snouts to extract insects from spiders' webs, so without the spiders coming along and eating the scorpion fly. Well, I didn't quite capture that here, but what I did capture was the spider from the spider's web being eaten and sucked dry by the scorpion fly doing its thing. They're able to sidle up to spiders' webs and get out insects that are trapped in them, and it seems here spiders too. And then top right, well, what about that? That is probably the most exciting thing I've ever seen in the garden. That is a zombie fly. That is a fly which has been devoured by entomopathogenic fungus. It's the fungus is now erupting from the fly and producing a halo of spores, each one of which is a potentially lethal weapon to the next fly that comes along. Of course, what they do, the fungus, when the fly is infected, they take over the fly's brain and cause the fly to stop flying, but walk up to the top of the highest point of the highest tree it can find, from where it can liberate the spores most effectively. And then the fly dies and the fungus erupts. So the zombie fly, perhaps the most exciting thing I've ever seen in our garden. And that for me is what this garden is about. It provides for wildlife in every sort of way. Just about finished, but when I described what I was going to talk about to Annabelle, she said, could I ask you a question? So I'll begin with that question. She said to me, how can the average garden owner or designer know their garden is working well? Does every gardener need a specialist naturalist like myself? Well, it'd be very good if you did, but you don't. Because so much of wildlife you can deal with in the way of proxy measures. Most people can identify butterflies or dragonflies perhaps, or birds. They're relatively few species, they're relatively easy to identify, and they are all pretty good indicators of the ecological health of a place. So anybody who knows anything about those can really start to get into the estimation of what benefits particular management or particular plant or particular activity in the garden is having for wildlife. Then, of course, those proxy measures may become a gateway drug for the deeper delights of nature. Now, the gateway drug has been really picked up by the staff of Beth Chatto's. As Dave has already mentioned, this wonderful garden, which is for me the epitome of rewilding the mind. That is our new Essex grassland, which has been invaded by all these wonderful flowers, or colonized, or in fact just plants that have grown up which were dormant in the seed bank. Allowing this to happen, rewilding the mind, that's bringing rewilding into the real world, into the gardens, and then just to follow up the further point that Annabelle made, we created a situation here where this is now coming as initiative from the staff. They're the mines are rewilded, and they're all involved in recording the wildlife. So the gateway drug of getting deeper and deeper into the wildlife, well, there you are. That's the moths that occur in a garden, or that's a few of the moths that occur in one small part of the garden on one night in July last year. And working with Carolyn and others in the garden, this is the sort of thing that we can all look forward to do and get to know more about it. That's what wildlife is all about. Go out there and deliver it. And I'm pleased to say that Beth, the vision of Beth at the outset, has enabled that to happen right here in front of our own eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful historical travelogue around a garden. I'm really grateful to you. I'm really grateful to you, Chris, for stressing that these beautiful decorative aliens that we all love in our gardens can really deliver on biodiversity. I'm all for native species as well, but to stress that gardens really, really can make such a huge difference. And sorry, I mustn't hog the limelight, but you get around those in suburbia and my goodness, what you've got. Just looking at the chat, I can see that Ed has been busy, and he says there's a small garden centre near Dusseldorf. The owner, a German, perhaps unsurprisingly, and I forget his name, sorry, Ed, worked for Beth, really influenced by her, and there's a demonstration of dry garden planting. He really sings her praises. Well, I suspect we all knew it was worldwide, but there's the proof of it. And Ed goes on, this is love and death in the garden, I think, as we've already heard. I heard a Zoom talk on Beth a few months ago, and it spent more time on her marital relationships than her planting ideas. Thank you so much for giving us a better understanding about her planting ideas, philosophy, etc. Thank you, Dave. So I'm glad we have rebalanced the interest. One from me, I'm afraid, which is perhaps slightly less exciting. How long did it take for the garden and nursery to overtake the fruit farm in terms of economics, land take, time absorption? Is it possible to predict? Not to predict, to recap on that?
I think, well, as I say, Beth, can you hear me, by the way? You can hear me?
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah, good. Beth started the nursery in 1967. So I think at that point, you know, the realization was they had to make some money to make, you know, to pay the wages and keep this alive, because the fruit, I can't remember exactly when the fruit farm was mainly sold off. It was in the mid 60s. So it's around about that time. And then it was really word of mouth, really, for the visitors coming to Beth. She was open for the National Garden Scheme for many years, just an honesty box going down into the garden. And then, of course, it all took off when she started exhibiting, and all the press and everybody just picked up on her ideas. So yeah, it's a difficult one to answer, but fruit farming was something that you're not, is as I said, you get 1 year good in 5 perhaps. And this soil here is not the best of fruit growing soil either. So I think, yeah, not that we make a lot of money growing plants either, but
a lot more biodiversity.
Yes.
Annabelle asks, did Andrew look wider than plants in his habitat interests, i.e. did he anticipate the arrival of zombie flies, etc.? Did you?
Andrew was interested in all things wild. I mean, he did have a very good knowledge of wildlife. As I say, he was quite a recluse. It was quite an honour to, you know, a privilege to speak to him when you did catch him around the garden. His work a lot of his work is up on our website. It's kind of hidden away a bit, but if you search around for the Andrew Chatto archives, there's some of his work there. And although it's mainly plant orientated, There is a lot on the on soil types and climatic conditions, etc. And of course the other main thing that they done was kept rainfall records, very important from a fruit growing point of view. And we do have some wonderful sort of records of the rain that's been taken here every Monday, 50, 60, no, hang on, since the 1950s. So that's 70 years or so of consistent rainfall records. And I think if we were a country, if the Tendring 100, which is our little district, sort of Clacton in the south and Harwich in the north and Colchester to the east, to the west rather, if we were a country, we would be the 5th driest country in Europe, on a par with many of the Greek islands and Greece itself. So it's a pretty dry area, interestingly. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Record keeping can make such a difference in history and understanding where we've come from. Excuse me. Ruth, I apologise if I've mispronounced your name. It asks, do you still have contact with Great Dixter and their sustainability programme?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we'll be some of our staff are actually going down there towards the end of the month, and we attend their plant fair. Fergus is, he's amazing what he's done down there. Their biodiversity audit has brought up, as we all know, how important gardens are. Probably even more so here. We're just surrounded by arable farms, monocrops. To have a garden in the middle of that must increase the diversity of wildlife, no matter what we grow. And as Chris said, Beth wasn't really gardening with that in mind, but as a default, as a beneficiary, has been the wildlife here. And it's great to have somebody on board who actually walks around the garden with those eyes, because all I can see is plants and jobs to do.
Yeah, could I just ask, following on from that, and remind us of the, I was going to say acreage, perhaps I should say hectareage of the garden, and whether that qualifies as a Lawson stepping stone, or does it have sufficient area to, well, it obviously has sufficient area to handle zombie flies and a few other evidence of biodiversity. If it was bigger, what would be different?
Well, the gardens at the moment, the gardens themselves and the whole property that we own is about 15 acres, sorry. The garden itself is about 6 or 7 hectares. So it's not a huge garden by any means, but it's a very intensely planted garden. We have no possibility really of expanding the garden, or no real wish to expand the garden. We have a lot to look after. It's an aging garden. It's a new challenge really. Beth, the garden's sort of gone through its younger years when it was dependent on Beth looking after it. It's gone through its teenage years, its wild years, and now it's needs looking after again because it's in its old age, some parts of it. So lots of renewal needs doing, which gives us the opportunity to introduce different plants, perhaps more wildlife friendly plants, pollinators, etc. And I think the diversity conditions we have just helps all that, the damp, the dry, the shade we have, it just we don't really have to think about it because the range of plants that we grow just attracts the wildlife. We're very lucky. I don't know where they all come from, how they find us, but they do. Chris, I'm sure, knows.
I mean, that's a very good point, Dave. I mean, as you said, it is a bit of an oasis in an arable desert of parts, but we are getting new wildlife coming in. We are seeing, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, the silver-washed fritillary has arrived as a butterfly in the garden. That's known from 1 or 2 woodlands in the vicinity within the 5-kilometre range, but they must be flying along hedgerows. There are hedgerows, and even though it looks like an arable desert, there is an awful lot of there is wildlife going on there in places, at least around the edges. It's on the top of the ridge. It's on this top of the ridge of the London clay with the sands and gravels on it, and that ridge runs continuously through northeast Essex. In fact, from Walton in northeast Essex right down to Epping Forest in southwest Essex. So that ridge has a concentration of wild areas amongst it, which can help to cross-fertilize each other with species. So yes, we are playing our part as an ecosystem, a wild ecosystem, going along with the Lawton principles of bigger, better, and well connected. And we are a key part of that well protection. In fact, a key node within the wider part of the overall ecological landscape.
Thanks, Chris. Annabelle, do you want to unmute and ask your questions?
Oh, I could do. Sorry, they're only just like little. I just wondered, and I keep forgetting in every one of these talks to ask where your archives are. Where are those post-planted drawings and the lists and correspondence? And you said about Andrew's things being, and I have seen that and been very amazed by that. But the other stuff, where's that then?
The bits of cardboard.
Yeah, I mean, well, we have quite a lot sort of tucked away on the nursery, but the majority of the really good, interesting stuff is held at the Garden Museum in London. So the Beth Chatto archives are held there.
Yes.
And so a visit down there, they've been well documented down there. Yeah, we have quite a lot here as well. I mean, yeah, we used to dread Beth's written lists because it meant more work for us, basically. But we kind of treasure them now.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And were you surprised that the garden was added to the list?
Not really. Not in the sort of. I know that funding was made available to list gardens, and so in that context it wasn't surprising, I guess. But I mean, we haven't got a lovely house attached to the garden. It's very interesting that they chose us based on Beth's philosophy. And the garden, I mean, the garden, you can look at pictures. I've shown you pictures from 15 years ago and you can still instantly recognize it. It's we're all so immersed in what Beth done. We any changes that are made are very sympathetic. Or out of our control, such as the storm we had last week.
Annabelle, you can have your last question. Has it resulted in increased visitors before we?
The listing. Well, certainly the day after. I can't remember. There was I think a press release went out on a Friday. Anyway, the Saturday was our busiest day. I mean, bearing in mind this was when
August. It was August
2020, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
So it was in COVID times, wasn't it? Yeah, we got it was our busiest day of the year, the Saturday. So we thought, oh, this is interesting, and then it just went back to normal the next week. Now it's queer as folk.
A short-term impact. Well, thank you both very much. Now I'll pass back to Annabelle, if I may.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry Helena and I have hogged most of the questions. But how lucky, I mean, blooming heck, how lucky and what good judgment on Beth Chatto's part, Dave, to find you and keep you there for such a long time so that then you could retell this story. I think this is really, it's been brilliant, and it's been really a really very interesting evening. Thank you so much. And Chris too for telling us about these. I love that zombie thing. I think I'm going to make one and stick it in my garden. And thank you for answering my question as well. That's one of the perks of my role here, that you can respond to that. Thank you. It's been really fascinating, both of you. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and information and all those wonderful images and things about the garden and the future. I mean, that's just fabulous, isn't it? You're on a win-win, aren't you?
No, it's yeah, I mean, what a wonderful story to be able to tell. So I feel very fortunate. But yeah, I mean, we have, you know, I mean, it's very important for us not just to remain Beth Chatto's Garden. She had a wonderful name, and if we can use that to some benefit, especially in these sort of times, you know, we're more than happy to do that. So thank you very much for listening. It was brilliant.